Hello, welcome. Welcome to my NIPSing students. For this presentation, you might notice I'm going to try doing it a little bit different. For whatever reason, my PowerPoint seems messed up. I don't know if I'm going to try to get the tech guys to look at it um, early next week. I think it's going to be probably, but so I might need to get a new laptop. But for now, um, what I want to do for this week for chapter 6 is I'm actually going to do this in Zoom. I'm going to try to do it in a more continuous take approach, which is a bit different than some of the other presentations I've been doing for you, but I think we should be able to survive it. Welcome. Social and emotional development in childhood. Okay. Next slide, but now I'm still alive. Okay. The first concept of the day is this notion of self-understanding, this idea that I'll just read my note here for a sec. During the second year of life, children, and this is something we've been talking about earlier in the course, children make considerable progress in their self-recognition and their ability to recognize that it's themselves they're looking at in a mirror and stuff like that. In the early childhood years, young children develop in many ways that enable them to enhance their self-understanding. Erikson had 8 developmental stages that he thought people went through at different times in their life. And so far we've learned about trust versus mistrust, right? Which is the first one that babies are in. And we've talked about autonomy versus shame and doubt, which was in chapter 4. Okay, so the next 2 stages, the stages we're going to be looking at today are initiative versus guilt and industry versus inferiority. And I want you to kind of really keep in mind this idea of how Erikson thought this was like a developmental crisis or a developmental dilemma, that it's a forced choice in the sense that it's not like you get to develop initiative or not. It's that you either develop initiative or there's this resulting or this counterweight that there's this tendency to develop feelings of guilt if that's not done. Okay, so I'll explain the initiative versus guilt and the industry versus inferiority. The next slide. Okay, here we go. All right, this is going decent. I feel like more nervous, even though it's not live. It feels like more live. It's kind of interesting just how emotionally it feels. Okay. So oh, oops. Oh, at least I don't totally wreck the recording if I press the button too many times, like in PowerPoint. So, initiative versus guilt. By early childhood, children are using their perceptual, so like how they're making sense of what they're seeing, their motor, how they're moving, their cognitive, how they're thinking, and their language, how they're speaking. So let me say that again. By early childhood, children use their perceptual, motor, cognitive, and language skills to make things happen and become convinced that they're their own person, right? So part of how this developing self, this developing understanding of who you are. And I always try to say to people in relation to this topic or to students specifically, I don't always say this to people randomly, but like, you're not your thoughts, you're not your behaviors, and you're not your emotions. You're someone that behaves and emotes and thinks. And there's a you there, there's a self there, and that sense of who that self is in the olden days of psychology, that was called the ego. Again, this is too big of a sidestep for right now, but to talk about what the difference between ego and self is kind of like saying what's the difference between identity and having an identity. And that's the point, is that you're not your identity. You're a human being that has an identity, which sounds like just linguistic, but is actually a major difference. Okay. Mike, stick to the lecture at hand. They have a surplus of energy that permits them to approach new areas, right? So I'm talking about kids, right? So kids are they have this like increased energy, right? Like their heart and lungs basically double as they enter into early childhood. They get much more physically able, even if things seem dangerous. They seem to have this undiminished zest, which is talking about overly fancy language, but just like they have this intensity. And that this initiative is also social too, right? It's like the initiative to go out and do things. It's basically like kids are at a stage where they have to do things and they have to learn that they can do things, and they do that through play, and they do that through interacting with other kids, and they do that largely through a process similar to experimentation. And that kids, if that gets stifled, if that gets hindered or repressed, the idea is that kids can have guilt about that. And I want to kind of make the point that what would guilt be to a young child is different than to like an adult. It's like it's this deep sense of feeling bad about not being able to do the things other kids are doing. It's like guilty for being who they are. And so Erikson's idea is that that's the big risk at this age. That's the big risk of having kids not around other kids or the lockdowns or whatever. It's like one of the reasons I said a lot about that is because industry and initiative were very much under threat. Okay, so let's go to the next one, and then I'll kind of be able to make that point better. So the second one of this industry, right? And usually when I present this slide in class, I'll always like usually ask a question like, what do you think of when you hear the word industry? And usually someone will say something like factory, right? And it's like, it's just a good way to explain the concept, because when you think of a factory, what do you think of? You think of something that makes things, right? You think of like a factory producing a product. And if someone was to say that you're very industrious, that would mean like maybe you started your own business, maybe you're like you started some club or some organization, you can like make things happen. And so notice how these two things sort of go together. The last slide, initiative, this kind of like impulse, I called it this undiminished zeal, or this like push towards wanting to do things. And that's also linked with this idea of like accomplishment and actually having the ability to work on projects and think of work on projects. Remember, we're talking about kids here. So these projects are developmentally relative. And what I mean is like learning language, learning the alphabet, learning early math, learning things like even how to play different games in sports and gym class. All these things are them learning to get better and better at interacting in successful ways with their environment through their ability to show initiative. So if someone was to ask me for a reference for you and do you have initiative, it's basically like, can you do things yourself? Or do you need to be handheld constantly? And like literally for kids, like my 2-year-old often does need to be literally handheld, right? But that now, and it's sometimes frustrating because now she always wants to like say, for example, put on her own socks, or she wants to put her own shirt on, even though it takes forever and it's super rushed in the morning and blah, 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 right? It's like what that really is her trying to initiate, and this like early, like literally initiate her experience, her like have effect on her world, that she can do things. And so that's initiative, and it's linked with industry, that you can complete tasks, you can focus on something and have that effect, you can get better at things. And Erikson warned that like if a kid doesn't develop that, they can develop an inferiority, a sense of inferiority. And that was like an earlier word in psychology. And you might have heard of the term like an inferiority complex. I'm pretty sure that's either Jung or Adler. It's one of the VN and one of the students of Freud. So if children encouraged to make efforts, to build, to work, to develop this greater sense of industry. And I was going to explain there, I've almost lost my point, but it came back to me in a chance of luck. But that in an inferiority complex was this concept that meant like, well, what's it mean to not have the abilities to develop your sense of control over yourself and your world as a kid by doing things like going to school and being involved in activities and interacting with people and stuff. It's like, well, kids can like learn that they are less than other people. They can have this like inferiority that literally means less than others. And it's like, again, it's why these things are somewhat, one of the reasons why these things are so powerful is that they're not like articulated experiences. It's not like the child's like would say that, but that you see it evident in their behavior, that it affects behavior, right? And so the idea of the inferiority complex is that that's that energy from that feeling somehow gets like stored in some complex, like a inferiority complex way. And a complex doesn't just mean it's complicated, but it sort of does. It like sort of does mean that at like a psychological energy level, if that even makes sense. And again, it's like tricky to find the right language to say like how an early negative event affects you now. It's like, and you say it's energy. What does that even mean? That it's like a stored physical connection in the brain. Just call it energy does make sense. It's a complex. The basic point though is that like if kids don't develop the idea that they can affect their world, they don't it's not that they just don't develop that, it's that they actually develop a sense that they can't, that they're not able to. Okay. Oh, so one of the big points on this slide, this is going to be I'm sorry, this is going to be like a little bit less polished obviously than like some of the other presentations, which maybe aren't that highly produced either, but like I don't know, you can probably tell I'm not freestyling, I'm using my slides and my notes, but I'm doing this in a more continuous recording than slide by slide. So the word that you highlight here is social comparison. I was actually talking about this in a different way with my class the other day, that if you ask my 2-year-old who she is, now she's not at a language level yet to really answer this question, but if Charlotte was able to answer that question, she would tell you maybe like what color her hair is, what color her eyes are, what she likes to eat, what shows she likes, what games she likes to play. She'd maybe tell you about her family. She'd maybe tell you that we have a cat. She'd like tell you these like things, right? But almost nothing, I would predict that she's not going to say anything like, I'm less pretty than my friends, or I'm cooler, or I'm considered funny, or I'm good at sports compared to my friends. It's like my 7-year-old might though. And the difference is that as kids get older, the way that they start to kind of evaluate themselves, and this is, you could maybe predict that this is moving towards a discussion related to self-esteem, that the way that they um, evaluate themselves or how they judge who they think they are starts to become more based on comparison, right? That it's how pretty am I is how pretty am I compared to other people. How cool am I is how cool am I compared to other people. And you can see this, that I might have said this to you already, but if you take like a 10-year-old and ask them how good they are at soccer, it tells you almost nothing about how good they actually are, and tells you more about how good their friends are if you know how good they are. Because that same kid could think that they're awesome at soccer because they're playing against kids that aren't very good, or they could think that they're brutal, but they might be playing against kids that are really good and they might actually be above average. So in both cases, their skills the same, but they in one case think they're awesome, in one case think that they're not good. And it's all because of social comparison. You're changing the comparison group, you're changing the reference group. Two main differences are evident when contrasting self-descriptions provided by early childhood with those in middle childhood. The first is a shift from describing oneself in more concrete physical terms, like hair color, stuff like that, to more psychological terms, like I'm a good friend or something. In early childhood, young children provide self-descriptions that involve body attributes, material possessions, and physical activities. For example, preschool children will often describe themselves in terms of things that they like to do, like things like play. In middle and late childhood, especially from 8 to 11, children increasingly describe themselves with the psychological characteristics and traits rather than with more concrete self-descriptions of younger children. Older children are more likely to describe themselves as popular, nice, helpful, smart, dumb. But notice how these are all more, they're not based on like physical characteristics as much. In addition, during the elementary school years, children become more likely to recognize the social aspects of self. They include references to their social group in their description, such as referring to themselves as Girl Guides or as Catholic or as someone who has 2 close friends. Children's self-understanding in the elementary school years includes increasing reference to social comparison. So I'm just sort of just giving a bit more detail than what's on the slide, just making more and more points to this idea that how they're seeing themselves is starting to be shaped by how they see themselves in comparison to others, and specifically others their age that they think are cool. Right? Because we care more about the opinions of the people that we care about. Whether we're aware or not. Okay. Consider a series of studies in which Diane Rubel investigates children's use of social comparison in their self-evaluations. Children were given a difficult task and then offered feedback on the task, as well as information about the performance of other kids that age. The children were then asked to self-evaluate. Children younger than 7 almost always made no reference to the other kids' performances. So they would do the thing, the person would ask how they thought they would do, and they would say it based on basically how they thought they did. However, many children older than 7 would include social comparative information in their description, like I did pretty good compared to the group. Or, there was a lot of people that were a lot better than me. Okay, so the main difference there is the social comparison aspect. Okay, self-esteem. Maybe I'll talk about the whole self-esteem and then start a new video just to make sure this is like I can check the audio and stuff on this one. Okay, so self-esteem. Developing a more adult-like sense of self, one that incorporates things like your psychological traits and is realistic and involves social comparison. And developing that affects self-esteem and can put kids at risk. So the same thing that allows the kid to start making those social comparisons, those comparisons could come back negative. If you're comparing yourself to everybody and the comparison is negative. So let's just back up. What's the word esteem mean? If you were to say you hold someone in high esteem, it's almost like saying you hold them in high respect, high status. You view them as important. It's like, okay, well, what about yourself? So if you have this second word here, we think about what self-concept is. That as the kid's getting older, they're getting an idea of when I was young and getting older, I was getting an idea of who Mike is. But then at the same time, I had an opinion on like how valuable of a person Mike is, how good he is at stuff, like how much I liked myself, basically my self-esteem, how much esteem I feel it's like a self-evaluation. I say they're a global evaluation of the self. So global means like the opposite of specific. It's across everything. It's like how you feel about yourself in general. Do you think you're a good person or not? That general. And that low self-esteem is something we're really concerned about, and for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is because it has a massive effect of behavior. How you feel about yourself has a huge effect on your behavior, and that's why it's linked with all the things you'd be afraid of as a parent. And especially Well, especially like the mental health, the suicide, the drug use, the delinquency, the issues even with obesity, because that's related to in one of the points being made is that it's like has a tie to self-esteem, that self-esteem affects how you view yourself, and how you see yourself affects how you behave. And it affects how you behave in all kinds of ways, how you treat yourself, how you think about yourself, how what you will accept in your relationships, how you view your future. All these things are coming from this central, because it's like, how do you view your future? Well, if you think that you're in that sentence is a bad person that's not worthy of good things, it's like, of course that affects how you see your future. And my point is that all this stuff matters because it affects how you behave, and some things become almost like self-fulfilling prophecy. Like we know that people with lower self-esteem will make less eye contact. When you make less eye contact with people, the chances that you, especially in Western culture, eye contact seems to be associated, not seems to be, it's associated with trust, that people that you hold eye contact with longer, and I know there's cultural differences on this, obviously, but can be associated with trust. So just hear me out with this example for a sec. So let's say that you have lower self-esteem, so you're making less eye contact. And I know people can make less eye contact for neurodivergent reasons, for all kinds of different reasons. But let's say it's because of self-esteem. What you're also doing is you're making the interaction with the person at the cash register or whatever a little bit weirder for them too. Weirder in the sense of less comforting, because when people aren't meeting your eyes, or reason your eye is so white, we read so much of intention from the eye, right? The reason the eye is white, just to finish that thought, is why you can tell right now I'm looking right at you, and you can tell that right now I'm not, and I'm only looking like a little bit higher. And the only reason you can tell where my pupil is looking is because it's obvious on the big white background of the rest of my eye. Okay, I think we did this slide. Complexity of self-esteem. And here's another thing that we should say about self-esteem is that, like, this is an important point that I don't think I have directly in my slides, but self-esteem is stable short-term and unstable long-term. And that's actually can be good news for people. So what that means is that it's stable short-term. So if I was to give you guys, say, a self-esteem survey and then another one tomorrow and then another one next week, your scores would be probably pretty consistent, pretty stable. But if I gave you a test today and I gave you another test in 3 years, it's not necessarily stable. There can be major changes in self-esteem over periods of time. Self-esteem can get better, it can get improved. But it only gets improved if you understand two things. Why is the person dealing with self-esteem issues? What specifically is causing it? And then you help them get better at that specific thing. If someone has self-esteem issues because they don't feel like they're good at talking to people, and you try to give them increased self-esteem by telling them they're good at sports, it's like you're just missing the target. So again, self-esteem interventions, if they're going to be successful, have to be correctly identify the source, and this is going to be different for each kid, correctly identify the source of the self-esteem issue, and then aim the intervention at building capacity in that specific area. Teachers, social workers, so I call this point the complexity of self-esteem development. Teachers, social workers, healthcare professionals, and others are often concerned about low self-esteem in the children they serve. One temptation is to deliver more frequent praise, but a growing body of research suggests caution in using this approach. Too many of today's children grow up receiving praise for mediocre or even poor performance, and as a consequence, have an inflated self-esteem. That then makes it difficult to handle competition and criticism. So the idea is that if you never get any pushback, if you never get any sand in the gears, if everything you do is perfect and the best, and here's a ribbon for this, and then you all of a sudden get into a scenario where you come up into actual competition or you actually run into some obstacles, the tendency to quit is huge. It's hard not to quit when you run into obstacles, especially if you've never had it. then they may have difficulty handling competition and criticism. Narcissistic parents, especially, can overvalue their kids' talent. That's a bit of a strong sentence. You see that a bit sometimes in sports and performance areas. This is vividly captured in the book called The Dumbing Down of Our Kids: Why American Children Feel Good About Themselves But Can't Read, Write, or Add. Devastating book written by a psychologist, last name Sykes, Sykes, in 1995. In a series of studies, researchers found that inflated praise, although well-intended, may cause children with low self-esteem to avoid important learning experiences like taking challenging tasks. Let me say that again. It basically means that kids that that receive praise for everything never get any negative feedback, and then in the future they get into a situation that's challenging, tend to buckle under the pressure. A study by Kang Lee and others at the University of Toronto in 2017 provides a poignant example of how the type of praise delivered influences a child's behavior. Preschool children played a game and were praised in one of two ways. Sorry, I know I'm like reading a bit to you. This isn't like the greatest on Zoom, but whatever. Some children were praised for their ability, saying things like, "Oh, you're so smart," whereas others were praised for their performance, like, "You did this very well." Children who were praised for their ability were actually more likely to cheat when given the opportunity to do so than were children who were praised for their performance. Consistent with previous evidence that praising children for intelligence can undermine task enjoyment and reduce persistence after failure, this study calls for a very thoughtful approach when praising children. Praising a child for being smart produces pressure to perform well in the future in order to meet others' expectation, pressure that can lead to negative behaviors like cheating, right? You're like basically praising them for that. So they're basically saying it's like more effective to praise the effort than to praise the underlying talent. Researchers have suggested several strategies for improving the self-esteem in at-risk children, considering these ideas. And this is basically what I said at the beginning. Identify the causes of the low self-esteem. The intervention should target the cause. Children have the highest self-esteem when they perform competently in the domains that are important to them. So when they get good at the things that they care about being good at. Therefore, it's helpful to encourage children to identify and value their areas of competence, such as maybe their academic skills, athletic skills, social skills, and then provide emotional and social support. Some children with low self-esteem come from conflictual families or conditions of abuse or neglect, situations in which emotional support is often unavailable. In some cases, alternative sources of support can be arranged either informally or through encouragement from a teacher, adult, coach. This is why things like big brothers, big sisters are so important. So that was all to just say building self-esteem is actually super important, but most of the ways that we try to do it are wrong because they're focusing on it as a general thing. And it is a general thing. It's a general thing in how it affects us, but it's not a general thing in how we fix it. The only way to fix it, quote unquote, fix it, improve it, is to correctly identify the source and aim the intervention at helping them get better at the specific thing. And then playing the role of sort of supportive coach and helping in that. Okay. Okay, let's do one more and then I'll then we'll end this video and start a new one. But I'll probably link them all together so I don't have to keep saying that because hopefully to you, you won't notice. Or maybe I'll put them up as maybe I'll put this presentation up in 2 parts or 3. Again, I appreciate that. I don't know. Hopefully you're giving me a bit of grace here. I know this is not as it's a little more on a little bit more flow based, let's say. So self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is the belief that one can master a situation and produce a favorable outcome. This is related to the ideas of Bandura. So if you remember Bandura from other parts of the course, where he talked about like how the Bobo doll experiments, right? That you could like hit the doll and then put kids in the room and the kids will mimic the behavior they've seen. That some of our learning is social observational. This is huge idea, but he also thought that he pushed for this concept of self-efficacy, that confidence is almost like too broad of a word, and that what we actually have is just like we have a thought of who we are, we have a thought of how good we are at certain things. And you hear people say this all the time. I'm no good at math. I can't speak in public. I can't do this, right? It's like it's a more specific thing. And one example, and I have his permission to talk about him, and I talk about him sometimes as an example of this specific concept. So for a long time when I was a university student, when I was like sort of a lot of your age, I worked for an organization called Extended Family, which is sort of like Big Brothers, uh, with a special focus on kids with developmental issues, or developmental delays, I should say. So this Jeremy, he's fine with me saying his name. So I worked with him for years, and so I would have been probably 20. He probably would have been like 15 or whatever. And I'd pick him up and we'd like hang out. He'd come over to my parents' house and hang out with my parents, and we'd like play games and like uh all kinds of stuff. Like he was into animals, he could sit and talk to my dad about like tractors like all day and explain all the different things about the engine and stuff. But I think I already said that he had really high functioning Asperger's. So but here's my point. If we were to go to the shortstop, like the convenience store, and I gave him like a $10 bill and said, I'll wait in the car. Can you go in, grab us each a pop and a bag of chips, and come back out to the car? That interaction with the clerk would be almost paralyzing to him. That the interaction was intense. Now he's gotten way better. Like he's gotten really strong socially now. He's married and has a part-time job, and he has a couple dogs. He's doing great. And it's not a sad story, but it's a story of to try to highlight this point of what self-efficacy means. That it means that like people can have a struggle in an area and still be highly productive in other areas. That's actually kind of a way to look at some of these developmental delays, and sometimes it's different, and I'm not trying to put them all under one umbrella, but this like highlighted issue in one area, although there's skills in others. So Bandura would say that this is like a better way to think of how skill development happens or how learning happens, that we basically have like an understanding of how good we are at stuff, and that actually affects our performance. If you don't think you can do something, it affects your performance, which is sort of obvious. But students with a low self-efficacy for learning, who like think that they're not good students, will avoid a lot of learning tasks, especially ones that are challenging. Kids that have a higher self-efficacy, so think that they're good students, will work longer at tasks. With kids with high self-efficacy are more likely to spend long periods of time on the same difficult thing, right? Because if you think that you can do it, you're gonna not quit as quick. So yeah. So anyways, I'm getting a bit rambly. So this is maybe a good time to start the second part of the video. Cheers.